name is Mara Gates, and I am super excited to be moderating today's conversation with one of our global DEIB strategists and trainers, Beth Ruffin. So today, as you all know, we will be talking about how to commemorate Juneteenth. And I would love if you could go ahead and drop in the chat your name and maybe where you're coming from or where you're visiting us from today. It's always great to see where people are from. Before we get into the chat, we're going to look at some of the ground rules here. So they're super simple sort of housekeeping rules, just to make sure that this is a safe and comfortable space for everybody who's joining. So first of all, once again, we encourage you to participate. So if you want, turn on your cameras or drop your name and where you're calling from in the chat box. Also, for your information, this conversation is being recorded. So note that you might show up on the recording if you are on camera. Also, you'll receive a rewatch link in a couple of days, between 2 and 4 business days from now, with this recording. And lastly, we want to keep this as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat box, or respond, or whatever it may be. Use that chat box as a medium to communicate with us. If you want to remain anonymous, you can DM me directly and ask a question, and I will ask it on your behalf. And before we go, I just wanted to share that this chat is SHRM eligible, so you can get SHRM credits through this chat. We'll leave the codes in the chat box, so make sure that you catch that as well. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest. I mentioned that we have a special guest today, and I'm just going to share a few insights about our very own Beth Ruffin. Based in South Carolina, Beth has over 20 years of experience in corporate America, focusing mostly on account management within the financial services industry. Her expertise is helping organizational leaders build work environments where everyone feels like they belong. And her superpower is creating spaces that make it easier to discuss difficult topics, which I can attest to be true. And I will go ahead and give it to you, Beth, to walk us through today's agenda.
Thanks, Mara, and greetings, everyone. Super excited to be with you all for a little bit today to talk about Juneteenth. So today we're going to talk about what is Juneteenth, how did this occur, what's the history, how do you celebrate Juneteenth both on the day and year round? And then we'll talk about some resources where you can learn more. And then we'll end the session with some Q&A. So please, as we're going through, feel free to drop those questions into the chat. And Mara will be sure to get those to me during our Q&A session. So first, before we jump in, I want to talk about language. Because when we're talking about the historical events and we're talking about Juneteenth, we want to make sure that we're using the appropriate language. Instead of using slave, you want to use enslaved persons or people who were enslaved. The difference in this terminology is that slave, it really denies the humanity of the person, and it puts that upon them, as opposed to recognizing that they were in a state of being enslaved. And so by using this correct terminology, it makes clear the humanity of people that we are talking about, that they were humans who were enslaved. So let's get into Juneteenth. You probably have already figured this out, but this is a very simple combination of 2 words, which is June, the combination of June and 19th. This day celebrates the final emancipation of the formerly enslaved. This day is also called Juneteenth Independence Day, Freedom Day, or Emancipation Day. Let's talk about how this happened. If we look at the timeline, this dates back to the Civil War, when there were a series of laws enacted to end slavery. There was the Confiscation Act of 1862, and that authorized Union troops to seize Confederate property, including enslaved people. Yes, we know that people were considered property at that time. On January 1st of 1863, President Lincoln issued the final draft of the act, declaring that all persons held as slaves are and henceforth shall be free. Millions of enslaved people were liberated on account of this act, but there were a lot of exceptions that were made, especially in border areas between Union and Confederate states. So the Senate tried to close this loophole by passing the 13th Amendment. Side note, if you've not had an opportunity to watch the documentary 13th, it's available on Netflix. It talks in depth about the 13th Amendment and how it continues slavery through incarceration. But the 13th Amendment, it prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude in all states, right? Except in the cases of incarceration. This was enacted in December of 1865, months after the end of the Civil War. But there were people in places like in Texas that didn't know that they were freed. They did not know, the news had not spread to them that they'd received this freedom. And so Galveston is really the birthplace of Juneteenth, and that's where Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army arrived, and he ordered General Order Number 3, and that was securing Union authority over Texas. And that is also when those people who were enslaved found out that they were actually freed. And this happened on June 19th, 1865. That's where we have Juneteenth. So for many people, many Black people in the US, this is a date that not only acknowledges the trauma of Black enslavement in America, right? But it's a reminder, because there were more than 250,000 people in captive for 2.5 years after they legally were emancipated. Now, it wasn't until 1980 when this was recognized at a state level, and Texas, no surprise to us, became the first state to designate Juneteenth as a holiday. It was then in 2021, and many states followed suit, but in 2021, when a bill was introduced establishing Juneteenth as a national holiday, and it passed through the Senate with unanimous consent and with a wide margin through the House. President Biden then signed this into law on June 17th, 2021, making Juneteenth, June 19th, a federally recognized holiday. Now, I want to make sure that as we're talking about Juneteenth and as we are talking about this becoming a federal holiday, I would be remiss if I did not talk about Miss Opal Lee. Opal Lee grew up in Texas, and she would spend Juneteenth, what's how a lot of Black people did, picnicking with her family. And she lived in a predominantly white neighborhood in Fort Worth. When she was 12, a mob of 500 white supremacists set fire to her home. The structure was destroyed, and unsurprisingly, no arrests were made. That hate crime pushed Mrs. Lee into a life of teaching and activism and campaigning. And in 2016, at the age of 89, which I just have to say, I'm half that age, and I don't know if I could do what she did, but she decided to walk from her home in Fort Worth to Washington, D.C. in an effort to get Juneteenth named a national holiday. She traveled 2.5 miles every day to symbolize the 2.5 years that Black Texans waited between the abolition of slavery and the day when they found out that they were freed. And so we see in these pictures here that President Biden had to have her a part of signing this into national law. Miss Lee is still alive and is considered the grandmother of the movement to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. So now that we know what it is, we know that it's a federal holiday. What do we do about it? How do we celebrate Juneteenth? What I want to do is, before we talk about how to celebrate it, I want to talk about how not to celebrate it. Yes, it is important to have representation, and it's also important to have tact. So some of you may remember a couple of years ago, these were two examples of companies who they decided they were going to celebrate Juneteenth through products. Walmart came out with a Juneteenth ice cream. I believe it was a red velvet flavor. And Bed Bath & Beyond came out with a Unity collection of products. And of course, we see the beautiful red, yellow, green, and black that is a part of the Pan-African movement. What's wrong with this, though? This is seen as pandering. This is seen as just slapping a cover on something and calling it a celebration. The question I want to know is, how does this celebrate freedom? How does this ice cream and this line of products advance the rights of Black people? It doesn't. And that's where the problem is. So let's take a look at how you should. First, we're going to take a look at how some other companies celebrate Juneteenth. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these. You can look and see, but you'll see how companies are making this a holiday, a paid holiday, so that employees can take off. Some companies are making this a day of education and activism. And they're saying, instead of having meetings, engage meaningfully with Black history. Other companies are participating in initiatives that give money to the community, that are giving employees time off, that are providing resources. So we can see the difference between the slide before and this slide, how this is now becoming a celebration, and it's now advancing the rights of Black people. Let's look at some other ways that you can celebrate Juneteenth, both individually and at work. The first is find an event in your neighborhood. Juneteenth activities are becoming more and more recognized within communities, and there are lots of celebrations and events that recognize and teach what the holiday is all about. I know here in Columbia, South Carolina, our library is doing an event. The city of Columbia is doing an event. There are lots of events happening that you can go and celebrate. But if not, or if you want to take this into your own hands, this could be a time to gather your friends and family and celebrate with them. This can help not only reflect and enjoy the festivities, but it can also be a learning opportunity for the people that are around you. While we're talking about Juneteenth, we also need to make sure that we are looking at this in relation to 4th of July. Both of these days are about freedom and liberation. However, historically, these days mean different things to Black people, because on the 4th of July, 1776, Black people were not free. And so learning about the different ways, this gives a perspective, and it places a critical lens on race and racism in America. If you want to learn more about this, Frederick Douglass gave a speech, and what is the slave? What to the slave is the 4th of July. He gave this on July 5th, 1852, and he talks more about what the 4th of July meant to enslaved people. While you're celebrating, we know that food is always a big part of celebrations. Perhaps think about cooking traditional foods for Juneteenth. There can be foods that represent prosperity, like collard greens and black-eyed peas. There can be red foods and drinks like punch, or you see watermelon or fruits and salads that represent the shed blood of enslaved Black people. Now, how can we even make more of an impact? With our dollars. Use this time to patronize Black businesses. Move beyond doing this only during Black History Month. This means being a regular or a frequent customer of a business. These are the types of things that help support the advancement of Black people within the American economy. And let's not forget all of the Black art. We're actually in June, which is Black Music Month. And so think of all the ways that we can appreciate Black art even during this time. Spotify has lists like Black Lives Matter, Black Girl Magic, the Black Power mixtape. You can read books written by Black authors and poets. You can watch TV shows and movies that are created by Black creators and talk about the Black experience. And even as the holiday passes, we have to continue to push for systemic change. As we are celebrating Juneteenth and we are celebrating the freedom of people who were formerly enslaved, we have to also remember all of the ways that oppression is still occurring in our current system. And so here are some groups that you could join in with the fight for racial justice all year round. What's some other ways to celebrate? How are you and your work team exploring anti-racism resources? Do you know what it means to be actively anti-racist? And what policies and procedures are you implementing at work to ensure that you are showing up that way in the world? If you're in your company and you see that not a lot is going on, use your voice, speak up to HR, ask them to do more. There's a saying that I used to use in my previous life, and it said, what doesn't get measured doesn't matter. So creating a diversity scorecard, creating goals, and then tracking your measurement along those goals. Offer extended self-care options. We talk a lot about how we want people to bring their full selves to work. Well, that includes all of the many societal pressures, societal events that are happening. How are you uplifting and supporting all employees, especially your Black employees, as we think in the context of Juneteenth, for self-care? Where are you spending your money, both individually and as an organization? Do you have organizational policies around diverse spending? How much of your money is going to Black communities? And then finally, listen directly to Black people about their experiences. Oftentimes, we may think as allies that we know what people need, but the best way for us to find out what people need is to ask. And there's this quote that I love. It says, nothing for us without us. Speak with your Black employees to learn how to support and celebrate them. Here are some great questions to get you started. What would you like to see that furthers Black engagement here? How can we celebrate our Black employees in a meaningful and authentic way? How can we incorporate Black history more into our culture? Asking these questions directly from the source will give you the answers that you're looking for. Finally, listen, if you can go to Google and you can put in Juneteenth, and you will find hundreds of resources. Fortunately, there's a lot out there around Juneteenth. What we've done here is we've just compiled a few resources for you that you can look at quickly. The first is, of course, here at PowerToFly, we have information around how companies can celebrate. You can go to juneteenth.com, which will tell you more about the history as well as celebration. And then the National Museum of African American History and Culture has a digital toolkit that you can use as well. It doesn't stop there, because there are tons of TV shows and documentaries. You'll see I've put some here with the network that they're on. I love that Cartoon Network has something. So there's really something here for people of all ages to learn. If podcasts are your things, we've listed here some podcast episodes that you can listen to around Juneteenth, including Be Anti-Racist with Dr. Kendi, who is one of the major voices in the anti-racism movement. And then finally, we've listed here some books. So books for children, as well as adults. And I had to include, if we go back to the book, I had to include this coloring book, because often when we are talking about Juneteenth, we are focusing on, a lot of the times, the history of enslavement leading up to freedom. But this is really a great opportunity to also rest and relax in freedom through coloring. That's one of the mindfulness practices that I practice. And so I had to include that here with the resources. But in closing, what I want you to remember, again, language matters. Juneteenth celebrates the final emancipation of the formerly enslaved. It's important to find meaningful ways to celebrate Juneteenth, remembering nothing for us without us. There are hundreds of existing resources that you can lean on and find ways to celebrate Juneteenth and Black freedom throughout the year. So I know you all submitted some great questions prior to today's chat, and I know that there may be some questions in the chat here. So I'm going to ask Mara to come back on and throw some questions to me, and let's answer what other outstanding questions you may have.
Sure. Thank you so much, Beth. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll go ahead and open it up to any audience members that want to come off mute or off their microphone, and then we'll get with the pre-submitted questions. Okay, somebody asked, how do you speak to Juneteenth when you have an international company?
This is very good. I'll have to tell you that American slavery is not just an American issue, it's a global issue. When you think about the diaspora and you think about the roots that people here whose, my roots come from those who are formerly enslaved, are part of the African diaspora. And so this is a global issue. This should be a global celebration. And so I think the same talking points that we have here are the talking points that you can use globally, that Juneteenth is a celebration of when those who were formerly enslaved in the United States received their final freedom. And as an act of solidarity, of global solidarity, that we want to celebrate in these types of ways.
Yeah, totally. And just an announcement, if you have a question, feel free, you still have time to put it in the box. I'm going to go ahead and go to some of the pre-submitted questions. I really like this one, and it's asking about some of the recurring mistakes that you've seen in your career with companies make surrounding Juneteenth.
Yeah, it's the question I always have is who is being centered? So when we're talking about a company showing up and being allies or wanting to celebrate, who is being centered and who is being harmed? Again, when we look back at the examples of Walmart and Bed Bath & Beyond or Bath & Body Works, who was being centered in that? Who was being helped through that? That's an act of performative allyship, because that did not advance freedom forward. And so when I think about mistakes that are made, some of the things I think about are when companies are being performative, or perhaps when companies are paralyzed with fear. So companies or leaders, they don't know how to address something, so they just don't address it at all because they don't want to make a mistake. But how does that look to the people who are looking in? It looks like you don't care about this because you haven't addressed it. I believe and I teach that it's better for you to be vulnerable, transparent, and to make note when you've made a mistake than to be silent and to not act at all.
Yeah, and along those lines, I wanted to ask if how can companies make sure that some of these ways to commemorate Juneteenth doesn't always fall on Black people?
Oh, that is so good. Let's talk about that emotional burden, right? Because that's often what happens, right? Is we say, oh, hey, okay, you're part of this community. Why don't you be the one who creates this? And we're putting this emotional burden or emotional tax on people. We're not providing them with any additional compensation or recognition. So again, I say there are so many resources available. There is education available. I'm a firm believer in having committees that are diverse, because I do believe that you need to have the perspective. Remember, nothing for us without us. So I do believe that you need to have the perspective at the table, but I believe in having a diverse representation of that committee or the planning committee that's putting these things in place and remembering the emotional burden and the emotional tax. Again, are we asking people to provide this labor without compensation or recognition?
Hmm. Food for thought for sure. And right off along the same topic of compensation, what are some things that companies with budget constraints can do? I know we've talked about some other ways, like, working financially with Black companies, but what can you do if there are budget constraints?
That's a good question. How is someone putting together a cultural celebration? How is that helping them further their career? So are they receiving something on their review? Are they going to have access to a mentor or a sponsor who can speak their names in rooms that they're not there? So what is the social capital perhaps that is being used to help uplift these people?
That's good. And then I wanted to know, PowerToFly is a remote company. If you had any other suggestions for ways to commemorate it, Juneteenth at a remote company.
Absolutely. I think some of the things that we've been talking about can apply for remote companies. So if this is a paid holiday, of course, we know that applies across the board. If you want to have a session like this, where people can come, they can learn education, right? They can commune with another over a virtual platform is a great way to celebrate in a remote way. And again, I think some sort of conversation. I think conversations are the best way for us to learn from our own individual perspectives, the needs that we have. And so how are you finding ways? And again, I don't want to just learn about Black history during February and on Juneteenth. What other opportunities throughout the year am I having to learn this virtually? What other virtual events are we putting on? Or education or email pieces that are sent out. So I think a lot of the celebration pieces can still be done virtually. I'm even thinking if you wanted to have some sort of food presentation, food part of this, is there a way where, I've had companies during COVID, they did virtual cooking classes. And so everyone, the company would send every employee maybe the resources they need to make a dish. And then they would all get together and they're all in their kitchens with their laptop and they're learning how to cook a dish. So really start to think creatively and out of the box of how can we do these things together, even while we're apart from each other? And how can I, as an organizational leader, help take some of that burden off as people are celebrating?
Great, yeah. We have a question in the chat. Well, it's more of a kind of wanting to get your commentary. This is an idea that this person recently shared with their company's DEI committee, and it says standardizing company-sponsored education on holidays that we don't officially shut down for. Then employees are permitted to take 30 to 60 minutes out of their day to learn about said holiday or history behind its culture. And that would be perhaps learning from the company or DEI committee curated resources rather than just asking them to do it themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think providing space for people to learn and providing those resources for them to learn are great. The question I would ask is, what is the hesitation around closing the office, right, for that holiday?
Especially since it's a federal holiday now. I think there's a lot more questioning going around that. And along similar lines, we got a pre-submitted question that gets a little bit deeper there. It says, how can we cultivate more incentives for non-BIPOC coworkers to invest in educating themselves more on the nuances of how different the corporate experience of, Juneteenth and commemorating Juneteenth can be for their, for the situation. So. Yeah.
I'm smiling because this is a question I feel I get every day just around this training, right? Is why should people be invested in this? And my answer again is, how does this relate to your organization's vision, mission, goals? How does this relate to the success of the business? How invested are leaders in this work? Are they sponsoring this work? Do leaders have expectations that they're going to they're going to display inclusive leadership throughout their role. How much are we talking about this as an organization? Or are we only talking about it during February, during June, maybe in September and October, we're talking about Hispanic Heritage Month, right? But is this a part of our DNA? Does being successful in this organization mean that you know how to be inclusive, that you have cultural competence or cultural humility? And I often say that this is also a really great way to find out who's a good fit for your company. So as you are interviewing people, as you are going through that recruitment process, this should be part of it, so that you are recruiting people who have the same values, who want the same things as what your company offers.
Now, we're going to shift a little bit from the corporate thought to more of a political theme. So this person said, we've seen more LGBTQIA+ and women's rights being attacked with different bills and laws, and people have been emboldened to speak their hate over the past several years, even with the politician saying that he does support segregation. So what steps can people take to fight back against this hate and prevent politicians from setting us back decades? And this is specifically asking, besides voting, what can we do?
I love this question. I saw this question come in, and I want to make first a caveat that voting is extremely important. So that is an extremely important step. And in addition, once you vote someone into office, that doesn't mean that they now get carte blanche to make the decisions, right? They are still there to represent you as a constituent. So those opportunities you have to communicate with your legislators, to let them know, this is what, as your constituent, I value. This is the legislation I want you to pay attention to. And so there are many advocacy organizations that will help you learn how do you start emailing and calling your representatives, right? So staying in constant communication so that they can still be representing the voice of their constituents. The other thing I will say is put your money where your mouth is. If there is an organization that is known to support hate, and there are a few organizations out there I'm thinking of, I'm not going to name any, but if you know that they support hate, are you still giving them your money? Are you still spending your dollars there and helping them stay in business? So put your money where your mouth is. Stop spending money with businesses that there's an organization here in Columbia that it's a restaurant. I love to eat there, but I recently found out that they support a cause that goes directly against my own personal beliefs. And so I have to stop eating there. Right. So remember, we talked about centering. Who are you centering? How can you put yourself in the place of people who are oppressed and start to think about, what changes can I make? So I think continuing to talk with your legislators, getting involved with advocacy organizations, putting your mouth where your money is. And then finally, I think we need more people to run for office that are progressive and have inclusive missions and inclusive visions and values. And that can be school board. It doesn't have to be running for Senate or Congress, but I have a friend who she's in a county in Pennsylvania that is less than 1% Black. And when she ran for school board, she had people telling her when she knocked on doors, we don't want Black people on our school board. So then what happens when you have a school board like that, where there are no Black voices, then how are those less than 1% Black children being treated? So consider, how can you get involved locally to make a change?
I also think that, those local changes have sort of a butterfly effect, and they'll become bigger and bigger. So that's a really good piece of advice there, Beth. And there's another question that's kind of adjacent as well. It says, as an immigrant who has lived among the Black community my entire life, How much are we doing to fix the culture or fix the issues that are affecting the community and the aspects of culture?
Can you read that one more time, please?
Yeah. As an immigrant who has lived among the Black community for my entire life, how much are we doing to fix the issues, or maybe what are we doing to fix the issues, or what can we do to fix the issues that are affecting the community and aspects of culture?
So a lot of the things that we see that are going wrong, that we may say need to be fixed within Black communities or even within minority communities across this country, they have their roots in systemic oppression. So how are we addressing systemic oppression? Again, with what we just talked about, who are we voting into office? How are we holding those lawmakers accountable? Or how are we ourselves getting into office to fix systemic changes? Where are we spending our money? How are we holding people accountable? Where are we giving our time? How are we giving back? What organizations are we feeding into whose mission is to fix systemic oppression? And we have to also remember something that we say all the time when we do trainings. The work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a marathon. It is not a sprint. While we would love to fix the problems of the world today, that's not going to happen. And so we have to have steadfastness. We have to keep going. Perfect example. In 2020, we know what happened, right? Some people say it was a racial reckoning. Everyone said, oh, we have to focus on this. We have to, Black Lives Matter. We have to make sure. Now, 2023, some of those same people, you won't hear a peep out of them about Black lives. So we have to remember that this is a marathon and we have to keep going. This is a generational thing. How are we teaching our children? Are we raising our children to be socially conscious? Are we raising our children to be equitable and inclusive? How are we making sure that after we're gone, that our values will still continue along in that next generation? There is a quote, this is kind of related, but economists believe that if we keep going at the rate we are as it comes to pay equity, that it will be 300 years before we reach pay equity. So how do we make sure that the fight continues for the next 300 years?
I did not know that. That is stark. Okay, we have a question here. It's about one of the participants says, if your HR department who is in charge of your DEIB work is still saying, I don't see color, how do you navigate that? I believe in my organization, the people who are in charge, who happen to be non-BIPOC individuals, that they mean well, but they can't see past their own bias. How do you begin to even address that?
I like this question. All right, a few things. So the first is thinking about intent versus impact. Helping people understand that you can have the greatest of intentions, but if your impact still causes harm, it causes harm. Now, this thought of I don't see color or everyone is the same to me is a myth. It's a myth of colorblindness. And what it does is it erases the systemic oppression and historic racism that in this country. So you can look at me and a white female colleague and say, I don't see color. You two are the same. But you have to also understand how my experience living life as a Black woman is different than her experience living life as a white woman. It also erases a person's identity because guess what? I love being Black. I love that part of my identity. I lean into that. I lean into my culture. And so for you to say that you don't see my color means that you don't see me. So I think having some conversations around intent versus impact, the myth of color blindness, how it erases the historical racism and erases the identity of Black people is a good way to start the conversation. If that doesn't work, then my next question is, who are we talking to next? Does it stop there? Or who do we have this conversation with next? And there are tons of resources that you could even use. Again, going back to the education and the resources, don't feel like you have to do this on your own. There are, if you go to YouTube and even put in the myth of color blindness, I assure you that you'll find some resources that you could use to help educate HR. But again, my question is, sorry, my cat is on my chair. The question is, then who else needs to be a part of the conversation if they refuse to listen to that perspective?
All right. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have for today. I'm just going to close us out. It's been amazing having you here, Beth. You're absolutely brilliant, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you would like to learn more about PowerToFly or how we can support you in your DEIB journey, please feel free to request your demo today, and we'll be happy to assist you with that. We'll drop a link in the chat to get better access as well. And having said that, thank you all for taking the time to join today's conversation. It's been a pleasure, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining, everyone.